In 1887, a 13-year-old scullery maid named Sarah Bowes woke at 4:30 in the morning in a Belgravia townhouse. Before she scrubbed her first pot, she ate a breakfast that would turn a modern stomach. Cold mutton fat on 3-day-old bread, washed down with yesterday's tea dregs. Number 14 on this list was so vile that even the workhouse rejected it. Number 3 contained an ingredient that Victorian doctors warned could kill you. These 20 breakfasts kept the lowest servants in Britain alive on less than 4 pence a day. Hit that subscribe button. Let us count down the 20 most disgusting breakfasts Victorian scullery maids actually ate before sunrise. Number 20. Cold beef dripping on yesterday's bread. This was the most common breakfast for a London scullery maid in the 1880s. The dripping had been scraped from the Sunday roast tin, strained through muslin by the cook on Monday, and stored in a chipped earthenware crock in the larder. By Friday morning, it had gone slightly rancid at the edges, taking on a sour tang the maid learned to swallow without flinching. She would saw a slab off yesterday's loaf with a dull knife, smear it thick with the gray-white fat, and eat standing at the scullery sink before 5 o'clock. A pound of beef dripping in 1882 cost about tuppence halfpenny. This was the cheapest possible fuel for human labor. She had 8 hours of fire laying, pot scrubbing, and boot blacking ahead of her. Number 19. Skilly. If the dripping had run out and bread alone would not do, the cook ladled out skilly. This was the workhouse's most famous gruel, and it had crept into servants' kitchens by the 1870s. 2 ounces of oatmeal stirred into a pint of boiling water, salt if you were lucky, sugar if you were not. No milk, no butter, no fruit. The result was a thin gray slurry that smelled vaguely of wet hay and slid down the throat like school paste. A pound of oatmeal cost 1 penny 3 farthings in 1875. Charles Dickens described skilly as the thinnest pretense of food the British poor were given, and he was writing about the workhouse, not about a respectable house in Mayfair. But the difference between the two was smaller than the upstairs family liked to imagine. Number 18. Bread soaked in small beer. Before tap water was considered safe to drink in most of London, even the children of poor families drank small beer. This was a weak ale brewed from the second mash of the brewery's barley, with about half the alcohol of modern lager, and a sour, bready flavor that turned undrinkable within 3 days of broaching the cask. For a scullery maid, breakfast was sometimes a hunk of stale bread torn into a wooden bowl, with a ladle of small beer poured over the top. A gallon of small beer cost about 1 penny in 1860. A 14-year-old maid drank it without thinking, because the alternative was the pump in the courtyard, which in cholera years was a quicker death than anything else on this list. Number 17. Burgoo. Burgoo started as a sailor's porridge in the Royal Navy. By the time it filtered down to scullery kitchens, it had become something even worse. Coarse oatmeal boiled the night before in water and a knob of mutton fat, then left to set solid in a tin overnight. In the morning, the maid sliced off a wedge of cold, congealed oat brick and ate it without warming it. The fat had separated and risen during cooling, leaving a greasy white crust on top that smelled of old sheep. Cold burgoo had the texture of damp plaster and the flavor of nothing in particular. It was the cheapest way to get a young girl through a morning of hauling coal scuttles. She did not have to chew. She just had to swallow. Number 16. Treacle scrapings on dry bread. When Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management appeared in 1861, it suggested that servants could be given treacle as an occasional treat. In practice, the treacle was never fresh. It was the dark, nearly crystallized sludge at the bottom of the household tin, scraped out with a wooden spoon and smeared across whatever bread was too stale to send back upstairs. By the time it reached the scullery maid, the treacle had developed a faint sulfurous tang from sitting in the larder for 6 months. The maid ate the scrapings because she was 13 and her body wanted sugar in any form. She would lick the spoon between bites, scraping every dark thread of molasses from the wooden bowl. It was the sweetest thing she would taste all week, and it tasted of something gone slightly off. First pattern break. Here is what nobody outside the kitchen knew. The Victorian scullery maid was the lowest paid servant in the entire household hierarchy. By the 1880s, a scullery maid in a respectable London townhouse earned between £8 and £12 a year. That is about 3 shillings and 9 pence a week, less than what the family spent on a single dinner party's worth of asparagus. She slept in a windowless room next to the boiler. She was the first up and the last to bed. She ate whatever the cook decided was not good enough to serve upstairs. Breakfast was not a meal, it was a calculation. How little could a young girl be fed and still scrub the kitchen flagstones until they shone? Number 15. Sour milk and crusts. When the milk turned in the larder, it was not thrown away. It was given to the scullery maid. The kitchen maid would skim off the worst of the curds, leaving behind a thin, sharp, faintly cheesy liquid that the household would not have given to the cat. Into this, the cook tore the heels of yesterday's loaves, the brown ends gone slightly dry. The bread soaked up the sour milk and swelled into a pale gray mush that the maid ate with a spoon, fast, before the smell could put her off. Once milk turned, it cost nothing at all. The lactic acid was, in fact, mostly safe to drink. But the texture, the smell, the way the curds clung to the tongue, none of that was scientific. It was simply what poverty tasted like at 5 in the morning. Number 14. Cold tripe. Here is the entry that even the workhouse rejected. By the 1890s, the Lambeth workhouse had officially struck cold tripe from its breakfast menu after the medical officer complained it was making inmates sick. But in the grand houses of Knightsbridge and Mayfair, scullery maids were still eating it. Tripe is the stomach lining of a cow, boiled until it turns from rubbery gray to white and gelatinous. Eaten hot with onions, it has its defenders. Eaten cold the morning after, sliced thin from a glass dish in the larder, it has none. The texture is somewhere between wet rubber and overcooked egg white. Tripe cost about 3/2 pence a pound at Smithfield Market in 1890, the cheapest meat available. The maid ate it because there was nothing else. Number 13. Pig's brawn. Brawn was the British answer to head cheese, and it appeared on Victorian breakfast tables across every class. Upstairs, the family ate brawn made from the meat of the pig's cheek, pressed neatly into a mold with herbs and white wine vinegar. Downstairs, the scullery maid ate the brawn made from everything else. The snout, the ears, the eyelids, the gristly bits the cook would not put in front of the master. All of this was boiled for hours, picked from the bone, packed into a basin with the cooking liquor, and set into a quivering gray-pink jelly overnight. Sliced cold for breakfast, scullery brawn had bits of cartilage that crunched between the teeth and tubes of soft fat that slid down the throat unchewed. The maid learned not to look too closely at what she was eating. Number 12. Salt cod ends. When the family ate poached salmon for dinner on Sunday, the scullery maid ate the salt cod ends on Monday morning. Salt cod was the cheapest preserved fish in Victorian Britain, brought in barrels from Newfoundland and Norway, dried to the consistency of leather, and so heavily salted that it required 2 days of soaking before it could be cooked. The thin tail ends and the bony scraps that were too tough to serve upstairs went into a separate bowl. By Monday, those scraps were boiled into a salty, stringy paste and spread on bread for the scullery maid. The salt content was so high that she would be thirsty until lunchtime. The maid ate it because she had learned by the age of 11 that hunger argued with no part of the human conscience. Number 11. Bloater paste. A bloater is a whole herring, salted only lightly and cold smoked until the skin turns a brassy gold and the flesh inside stays soft and oily. Bloater paste was what the cook made when the smoked herring had been on the marble slab in the larder 3 days too long and was starting to go off at the edges. She would scrape every bit of flesh from the bones, mash it with butter and a spoonful of vinegar to mask the rising fishiness, and press it into a small earthenware jar that lived on the bottom shelf. The scullery maid spread it on toast at 4:30 in the morning, when the kitchen still smelled of last night's coal smoke. The paste had the salty intensity of anchovy and the soft, slightly rotten texture of fish that had spent too long out of cold storage. Second pattern break. Here is the economy nobody talked about. A Victorian household of 15 people, upstairs and downstairs combined, generated an extraordinary amount of food waste every single day. None of this was thrown away. The cook had built her entire weekly menu around the assumption that the staff would be fed on what the family did not eat. By the time the food reached the scullery maid, it had been picked over by the housekeeper, the butler, the cook, the kitchen maid, the parlor maid, and the boot boy in that order. She was last in a queue of 9. What arrived on her plate at 5 in the morning was, by definition, what no one else had wanted to take. This was not cruelty. This was the system. And it was the system that built every grand house in Belgravia. Number 10. Cold peas pudding. Peas pudding was made from yellow split peas boiled with a ham hock until the peas dissolved into a thick, dense yellow paste that was poured into a cloth bag and pressed under a weight overnight. Hot, fresh from the cooking liquor, it was actually quite good. Cold, sliced from a refrigerated block at 5 in the morning, it was something else entirely. The cold peas pudding had the texture of dense modeling clay and the faint metallic tang of legumes that had been sitting in their own steam for 14 hours. The maid ate it in slices about half an inch thick, balanced on a slab of bread, with no butter and no salt. There is a nursery rhyme about peas pudding hot, peas pudding cold, peas pudding in the pot 9 days old. That was not a nursery rhyme to a scullery maid. It was a description of her breakfast schedule. Number 9. Mutton fat tea. When the household ran out of tea leaves and the next delivery from the grocer was still 3 days away, the cook brewed something else for the staff. Mutton fat tea was hot water poured over a knob of cold mutton fat and a pinch of salt, served in a tin mug at 5:15. The fat melted slowly, forming an oily slick across the top of the water, and the maid drank it down with her bread, while the grease coated the inside of her mouth. The reasoning was almost medical. Mutton fat was thought to fortify the lungs against the cold of an unheated scullery in February. The closest modern comparison is melting a wax candle in boiled water and drinking it. The maid drank it because the kitchen was 40 degrees Fahrenheit and her hands were already going numb. Number 8. Bone marrow scrapings. When the family had a roast beef bone on Sunday, the marrow was scooped out for the master's toast at dinner. The bone was then boiled for stock on Monday. By Tuesday morning, the bone had been split lengthwise by the cook with a cleaver. Whatever marrow was left clinging to the inside of the cavities, the dark, almost black, slightly burnt fragments that the master had refused to eat, was scraped onto a piece of bread for the scullery maid. The scraped marrow was the consistency of warm tallow and tasted of beef and old iron in equal measure. Modern nutritionists now know that bone marrow is one of the richest sources of vitamin K2 in the human diet. The scullery maid did not know this. She just knew that on the Tuesdays when there was marrow, she could lift coal scuttles for longer before her arms started to shake. Number 7. Sheep's lights. This is the one where the medical complaints started. Sheep's lights are sheep's lungs, boiled until they turn from spongy pink to pale gray, then sliced and served. In Victorian Scotland and northern England, sheep's lights were considered an acceptable breakfast meat for servants and children. In London, they had largely fallen out of fashion by 1880, but a few cooks still served them to the scullery staff because they cost almost nothing. A pair of sheep's lungs at Smithfield Market cost a halfpenny in 1885. Cooked lung has the consistency of a wet kitchen sponge, full of small chambers that collapse when you bite into them, releasing a metallic, faintly bloody liquid into the mouth. There were occasional reports in the Lancet during the 1870s of lungworms in undercooked sheep's lights, causing intestinal complaints. The cooks dismissed this as nonsense. The maids got sick anyway. Number 6. Faggots. A faggot in Victorian England was a meatball made from minced pig's offal. The recipe varied by region, but the core ingredients were always the same: pig's liver, pig's heart, pig's lungs, pig's spleen, and pig's caul fat, all minced together with onion and breadcrumbs, were formed into balls about the size of a large walnut, wrapped in more caul fat, and baked in the oven until the outside crisped to a dark mahogany. Eaten hot for the family's supper, a faggot is genuinely good. Eaten cold for the scullery maid's breakfast the morning after, with the caul fat congealed white and the inside compressed into a dense livery paste, a faggot is a different proposition entirely. The smell of cold pork liver and rendered caul fat at 4:30 in the morning is something modern people cannot imagine, because no one would willingly choose to smell it. Third pattern break. Now here is what changed everything. By the 1890s, a series of reforms began to shift how servants were fed. Mrs. Beeton's later editions started recommending that scullery maids be given hot porridge and a cup of cocoa for breakfast, rather than whatever the cook decided was leftover. The servants' hall movement, led by a handful of progressive housekeepers, pushed for a daily meat allowance and a proper sit-down breakfast. But here is the part nobody mentions. The First World War took the maids out of the kitchens entirely. The scullery maid disappeared, not because she was finally given decent food, but because she walked out of the back door in 1916 to work in a munitions factory and never came back. The cold tripe ended because the workforce ended. Number 5. Black pudding ends. When the family had black pudding for Sunday breakfast, the scullery maid had the ends on Monday. Black pudding is a sausage made from pig's blood, pork fat, and oatmeal, stuffed into a length of intestine and boiled until set. The ends were the closed-off knots where the sausage had been tied, full of overcooked, slightly bitter blood paste with a tough, leathery casing. The cook would slice these into rounds and fry them in lard for the scullery staff. The black pudding ends had a particular taste that lingered in the back of the throat, like iron, like burnt grain, like the inside of an old kettle. The maid ate them because they were warm, and warm food in a freezing scullery at 5 in the morning was worth almost any flavor. The blood gave her iron her body desperately needed. She did not know this. The cook did not know this either. Number 4. Calf's foot jelly scraps. Here is where Victorian medicine and Victorian poverty collided in the strangest way. Calf's foot jelly was considered the gold standard of invalid food. It was given to recovering patients in hospitals, to women after childbirth, and to elderly relatives on their deathbeds. The jelly was made by boiling calf's feet for 6 hours until the gelatin dissolved out of the bones, then straining the liquid, flavoring it with lemon and sherry, and setting it overnight in a glass mold. Upstairs, the patient ate it with a silver spoon. Downstairs, the scullery maid ate the scraps. These were the unflavored, unfiltered remains at the bottom of the boiling pot. Dark gray, cloudy, set into a quivering mass with bits of skin and cartilage suspended throughout. The maid was being fed the same nutritional substance the family's invalid was eating upstairs, She just did not get the spoon, the bowl, the lemon, or the dignity. Number 3. Chalked milk and bread. Here is the breakfast that Victorian doctors warned could kill you. Milk adulteration was the great public health scandal of the 19th century. Dairymen watered down their milk to stretch profits, then added chalk to whiten it back up, and sometimes formaldehyde to keep it from souring. By the 1870s, government chemists were testing London milk supplies and finding that almost 2/3 of it had been adulterated. The chalk gave the milk a strange grittiness that settled at the bottom of the cup. The kitchens of grand London houses bought their cheapest milk for the servants' breakfast. The scullery maid drank chalked, watered, sometimes formaldehyde-laced milk poured over bread crusts at 5 in the morning. The Lancet ran articles about it. Parliament debated it. The Sale of Food and Drugs Act of 1875 was passed specifically to try to stop it, and it did not work. The maids who drank it long enough developed chronic digestive complaints by the time they were 20. Number 2. Cow heel broth. A cow's heel is the lower portion of the leg, mostly bone, skin, and connective tissue, with almost no actual meat. Boiled for 8 hours, a cow's heel released enough gelatin and marrow to thicken a pot of water into something between a broth and a glue. The cook made cow heel broth on Sundays, and the scullery maid drank it for breakfast on Mondays, sometimes Tuesdays, sometimes through Wednesday if the pot was big enough. By Wednesday, the broth had been reheated 3 times, had developed a thin film on top, and tasted faintly of the iron pot it lived in. The broth was poured into a tin mug, sprinkled with salt, and given to the maid with a hunk of bread to dip. Modern bone broth enthusiasts now pay $9 a cup for essentially this same liquid at specialty grocery stores. The scullery maid drank it 3 mornings a week and did not consider it a luxury. Number 1. Bread, dripping, and used tea leaves. This is the breakfast that no list of Victorian servant food ever quite captures, because it was so ordinary that no one bothered to write it down. Yesterday's bread, sliced thick. The bottom of the dripping crock, scraped out and smeared on top. A mug of tea brewed not from fresh leaves, but from the used leaves that had already been steeped once for the family's morning pot. The cook would shake the wet leaves from the strainer back into a second teapot, pour fresh boiling water over them, and let them steep again for the staff. The second brew was thin, pale, slightly bitter, and almost colorless. The maid drank it without milk or sugar because milk was for the upstairs breakfast and sugar was kept in a locked tin. This breakfast was eaten standing up in the scullery at 5 in the morning, every weekday morning, for the entire 2 or 3 years that a girl worked in this position. It is the most forgotten meal in British history because it was the most common, and because the people who ate it were never asked what they thought about it. Here is the challenge. Try just one of these this week. The cold peas pudding sliced from the fridge, the bread and dripping, the second brew tea, not because any of it sounds appetizing, but because for a 13-year-old girl in 1880, this was Monday morning. Tell me in the comments which one you would have managed to swallow at 5 in the morning before scrubbing flagstones in a freezing scullery. Because these breakfasts were not just disgusting. They were the daily reality of girls whose names mostly did not survive. They worked, they ate, they were not remembered. Now you remember them.